As the investigation continues, scholars trace the lineage of these maps backward, uncovering chains of copying that led not to medieval imagination, but to ancient source material. Long-lost mapmakers often admitted their work was compilation, not invention, stitching together fragments from older charts preserved in monasteries, ports, and private collections. It seems accuracy survived through repetition, not understanding, as later cartographers trusted inherited measurements without knowing their origin. In this way, ancient geography traveled forward in time even as the lands themselves slipped beneath water or ice. Take a look at this. Certain maps depict Antarctica without ice. For centuries, this was dismissed outright. But modern geological evidence now complicates things, showing that parts of the continent were indeed ice-free thousands of years ago. These maps don't show fantasy mountains or dragons. They show realistic shore contours hidden beneath kilometers of ice today. If these depictions are accurate, then someone must have charted Antarctica before it froze. This suggests global awareness in an age we consider technologically incapable of such surveying. Suddenly, ancient legends begin to take on new meaning. Plato's Atlantis, Hindu accounts of submerged realms, and indigenous stories of vanished southern worlds all seem to converge on a similar theme: a great southern land, destroyed by cold or flood. It's as if when landscapes vanish, language adapts, encoding place into myth. Perhaps maps and legends are parallel archives, one technical, one symbolic, both carrying fragments of a lost world. Separated, they seem implausible, but together they form a pattern that's difficult to dismiss. Archaeology struggles to engage with these claims directly. Excavation favors dry land, reinforcing a bias toward what survived visibly. It's hard to dig beneath kilometers of ice or deep sea breadths, but absence of ruins does not equal absence of civilization, especially when climate acts as an eraser. The ancient maps themselves might be archaeological evidence, preserving spatial knowledge when physical traces are unreachable. So the mystery deepens. If ancient maps preserve the memory of lands that vanished, then our relationship with Earth is far older and more fragile than we assumed. These maps aren't just anomalies. They might be warnings, reminders that geography itself is temporary. The question is no longer whether the maps are wrong, but whether we are prepared to accept how much of our own world and our own past may be missing from view entirely. What if I told you that ancient maps, often dismissed as fantasy, might actually be lost snapshots of our world? For centuries, we've stared at charts showing impossible features, vast inland seas in the middle of deserts, and great rivers where today there's only sand. But what if these weren't mistakes? What if they were memories? As our focus shifts from the poles to the temperate zones, we're finding that these old maps align with cutting-edge science. Geological evidence now confirms that places like the Sahara and the Arabian Peninsula were once lush and green. They were crisscrossed by massive river systems and dotted with huge lakes during humid periods thousands of years ago. It seems ancient mapmakers weren't inventing these landscapes. They were recording them just before climate change erased them from the earth. These lost worlds also intersect with legends of vanished civilizations, powerful cultures said to have thrived where nothing grows now. Stories of great cities in the Sahara or Central Asia suddenly make sense when you see them placed along waterways on an ancient chart. It est as if the memory of these places was carried by migrating peoples when the climate collapsed. They carried stories of home, and those stories became maps, anchoring their vanished lands in geometry long after the soil turned to dust. Even forbidden texts, often sidelined as mere allegory, describe these same impossible places. They speak of lands destroyed by drought or fire, matching features we're only now rediscovering with satellite imaging. It seems in this light, these maps aren't miracles. They're artifacts of human mobility, erased by a changing climate, not by ignorance. So, where's the proof? The challenge is that archaeology is biased toward land. Exploring submerged sites is incredibly difficult and expensive. Underwater drones might spot intriguing stone anomalies, but without massive investment, these clues remain inconclusive. When physical evidence is out of reach, paper evidence like maps becomes suspect. We tend to privilege what we can easily dig up, sidelining anything that forces us to rethink our history. There's also a subtle political angle, acknowledging that continents shrank and expanded. Within human memory complicates modern borders and claims of timeless ownership. It's often easier for institutions to label these maps as anomalies rather than integrate their disruptive implications. The result isn't deliberate censorship, but a quiet omission, reinforcing a static view of a world that has always been in motion. Ultimately, these ancient maps are quiet witnesses to disappearance on a planetary scale. They remind us that our own world is just a snapshot in time. They hold the memory of lands that migrated, of knowledge passed imperfectly through generations, and of entire worlds that slipped beneath the waves. What seems impossible to us today may simply be a forgotten reality. Have you ever seen an ancient map showing lands that just don't exist? For centuries, we've dismissed them as fantasy, the product of overactive imaginations. But what if they weren't fantasy at all? What if they were memories? As scholars dig deeper, they're finding forbidden texts and long-lost manuscripts that describe these impossible places. What was once seen as allegory is now being read alongside old maps with fresh eyes. These aren't just stories of sunken plains and vanished islands. They might be a form of encoded geography. When direct knowledge threatened the established order, it was often disguised as myth to survive. These texts didn't save coordinates, they saved the memory of a place, allowing cartographic truth to persist even when the literal maps were destroyed or deemed too dangerous to exist. History isn't just written by the victors, it's also edited by the administrators. When empires wanted to solidify their power, they needed a single unified story, maps that showed a different version of the world, with prior inhabitants or forgotten claims undermined that authority. So, they were altered. Coastlines were simplified, entire regions were removed, and redacted passages became common. By narrowing the world, power stabilized itself. Ancient maps showing impossible lands were inconvenient because they suggested a past that couldn't be controlled. Over time, curiosity was replaced by repetition, and any geography that didn't fit the official narrative was labeled an error. Then there's the planet itself. Climate change isn't a new phenomenon. Shifting seas and melting ice have rendered maps obsolete within centuries. Imagine a later generation, unaware of this rapid environmental change, comparing an old, accurate chart to their new coastline. They'd find it wanting, not because the map was wrong, but because the world itself had moved on. Climate can erase credibility just as effectively as it erases cities, burying truth under layers of assumption. A map can easily outlive the landscape it depicts, becoming a confusing artifact instead of a guide. But now, modern technology is giving us a new way to look at the past. Using powerful simulations, we can rewind Earth's surface, watching continents reshape, seas retreat, and ice melt backward in time. And something incredible happens. When these ancient maps align with the reconstructed coastlines of the past, skepticism starts to soften. This doesn't validate every old chart, of course, but it shows they are plausible. What once seemed absurd becomes possible within known climatic cycles. The past is quietly expanding, not through some grand revelation, but through data that allows ancient memory to re-enter the scientific conversation. So these ancient maps are at a crossroads, caught between myth and model, neither fully accepted nor easily dismissed. They endure because they remind us that our history is provisional. Lands appear and vanish. Knowledge survives unevenly, and what we remember is shaped by power. Perhaps the real mystery isn't why these maps show impossible places, but why we assume our present world is the only one that ever mattered. Somewhere between the faded ink and the shifting ice lies a record of an Earth we no longer recognize, just waiting for us to see it again. Have you ever looked at an old map and just seen a piece of art? A curiosity? Well, modern archaeology is starting to see them as data. Instead of just digging for ruins, researchers are now combining cartography, geology, and archaeology on a massive scale. They layer ancient charts onto satellite imagery, and what they're finding is truly fascinating. Slowly, patterns are emerging. It's not a single aha moment, but a steady accumulation of evidence. River mouths line up with old drawings, submerged plateaus match hand-drawn contours, and mountain ranges. Once thought to be fantasy, appeared distorted only by millennia of erosion. This patient process reveals a deep-seated bias in how we view history. We've always preferred impressive ruins over humble roots. We remember civilizations that built in stone, but what about those who traveled, traded, and mapped the world? These ancient maps prioritize coastlines, currents, and safe passages. They reflect a society defined by mobility and connection, not just settlement. It suggests some cultures invested more in knowing the world than in owning it. When the climate shifted and the seas rose, their monumental cities may have vanished, but their knowledge survived in these charts. The evidence was there all along, we just weren't looking for it in the right way. Now, artificial intelligence is supercharging this revaluation. AI can compare thousands of ancient maps at once, spotting recurring features that were once dismissed as individual mistakes. When the same impossible coastline appears in maps from different cultures across centuries, it's no longer a coincidence. It points to a shared, much older source of information, a legacy from a world whose original context has been lost to time. Of course, this gets political. Redefining ancient geography challenges our modern narratives of exploration and discovery. If ancient people already knew about these lost lands, it complicates our heroic histories. It's often easier to label ancient knowledge as primitive than to confront a past that was more globally aware than we're comfortable admitting. But these maps feel so human. They're imperfect, faded, yet they've persisted against centuries of doubt. They aren't asking for blind belief, just for a fresh look. They remind us that knowledge doesn't always move in a straight line. Information can survive a catastrophe even when the explanation for it is lost. In their impossible lands lies a quiet record of adaptation, loss, and memory, reminding us that our world is just the latest of many. As the inquiry deepens, we turn our focus inward to the psychology of dismissal. Why do we resist these ancient maps? It's because they challenge more than just geography. They challenge our sense of certainty. In the quiet halls of libraries, scholars pause, poring over contradictions they can't easily resolve. Humans, by nature, prefer stable, predictable worlds. Maps, showing lands that shouldn't exist, disrupt that comfort. When a piece of evidence threatens our coherent worldview, it's often easier to doubt the artifact itself than to re-examine our long-held assumptions. This isn't a malicious act, but a protective one-an instinct to preserve our identity and sense of order. Ancient maps linger at the edge of acceptance because they hint at a past that was less linear, less predictable, and far more fragile than our modern stories allow. This resistance is reinforced from a young age. Our education systems favor clean timelines and definitive boundaries. Think back to the classroom maps of your childhood. Continents were fixed. Oceans were eternal. Ambiguity is often trimmed away in the name of clarity, leaving little room for vanished lands or forgotten coastlines. So, when ancient charts contradict the modern atlas, they're treated as historical curiosities, not as teaching tools. Over time, this repetition hardens our assumptions. We learn that the world is a finished product, not an evolving one. When we're later confronted with these older maps, we simply lack the mental framework to integrate them. The impossible becomes incorrect by default, and this cycle of dismissal repeats across generations. The media also plays a huge role in shaping our perception. Ancient maps are frequently framed as fringe theories or pure fantasy, stripped of all nuance for the sake of spectacle. Sensational headlines about lost continents often bury the careful academic analysis. This exaggeration is harmful because it destroys credibility, allowing skeptics to dismiss all anomalies in one fell swoop. When a genuine mystery is packaged as cheap entertainment, it loses its legitimacy as a serious field of inquiry. This allows the status quo to persist, as complex evidence is drowned out by louder, simpler narratives. These maps remain misunderstood, caught in an intellectual limbo too disruptive for orthodox history, yet too restrained for popular myth-making. But curiosity perseveres. Away from the spotlight, independent researchers are quietly connecting the dots. They spend their nights comparing charts, cross-referencing climate data, and analyzing ancient migration models, driven by a desire for knowledge, not recognition. Real progress often begins here, at the margins, where difficult questions are allowed to exist without immediate answers. These researchers aren't necessarily claiming to have found Atlantis, but they are documenting patterns, consistencies, and plausibilities that are hard to ignore. Over time, their work builds a parallel archive, one that resists easy dismissal. In the end, these maps are like mirrors, reflecting how we as a society handle uncertainty. They persist because they occupy the space between what we remember and what we choose to deny. Accepting them doesn't mean we have to rewrite every history book. It simply means admitting that our past might be far larger and more complex than we've recorded. These maps pose a fundamental question. Is history a finished story, or is it an ongoing investigation? Their survival suggests some truths can wait patiently, ready to resurface when we're finally ready to question ourselves, instead of just defending our certainty. In the final reckoning, ancient maps no longer ask to be proven right or wrong. They ask to be understood in the context of loss. As we gaze over silent oceans, deserts, and ice, we're looking at witnesses to worlds that existed and then simply withdrew. These maps are memory made visible, fragile attempts to resist erasure. When lands vanish, those who remember them become anomalies, and their records become inconvenient truths. The impossible places on ancient charts aren't mistakes. They are absences made legible, traces of realities that slipped beyond our reach, but not beyond recall. Seen this way, these maps reveal more about humanity than about geography, exposing how knowledge survives catastrophe unevenly. Stone sinks, cities drown, but information migrates, carried by those who flee. The ancient mapmakers were archivists of motion, not masters of territory. Their work suggests they understood the world was temporary, that recording it mattered more than owning it. When later civilizations inherited these charts without inheriting the memory of collapse, confusion replaced comprehension. A warning was mistaken for an error. Today, we stand at a similar threshold, surrounded by data yet resistant to its implications. As we overlay ancient vanished coastlines with our present cities at sea level, the alignment is eerie. Ancient maps remind us that change doesn't announce itself dramatically. It accumulates quietly until memory fails. The same forces that erased lands before are still active now. What separates us from those forgotten worlds is not technology, but awareness. The maps endure because someone long ago noticed the ground was moving and chose to remember rather than deny it. These charts survived centuries of dismissal because they carried something stubborn: coherence. They did not conform, so they waited. Their re-emergent signals not a revelation, but our own readiness, a moment when humanity begins to accept that its past is larger, messier, and more fragile than stories of linear progress allow. The most dangerous illusion is permanence. Ancient maps show lands that should not exist because they no longer do, and one day our own maps may puzzle those who come after us. They will ask how we missed the signs, how we trusted stability over memory. Somewhere between ink and silence lies a warning, written by the survivors of vanished worlds, reminding us that the earth always moves, and history only survives if we are willing to follow it.